Okay, good. Okay. All right. Good morning. Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov, everybody. For the slight technical glitch, we are ready to go. So we are continuing our discussion of Hilchot Bishul. We're in volume 18 of Tzurba Rabbanan. We are towards the end of what's listed here as Shiur number 2. So let's pick it up on page 93 in the books. Again, we are concluding now our discussion of Bishul the Oraita. Don't worry, we have much more to talk about Bishul the Rabbanan. The truth is that Bishul the Rabbanan is probably far more complicated and far more relevant from week to week than maybe some of the things we've just been discussing until now. But we'll get there. Let's not makdim v'tamucha. So the last thing we spoke about was the concept of megis, the concept of stirring food that's on the fire, ladling out. I won't repeat everything that we said. But one of the things that we saw there was that we saw there was a concept, not just of cooking, but anything that would expedite the cooking process. That's why you have this discussion regarding stirring. You stir the food, that causes it to cook quicker. And anytime we have a food which is not fully cooked, so therefore this is going to be a concern. So you have a look at page 93. The source for this really is in Tosfot. Tosfot says in source number 29, he says, we'll see this halakha again a little bit later. But this is referring to a discussion regarding hatmana, regarding insulation, which again is less relevant nowadays. Nowadays we have all sorts of hot plates and slow cookers and all sorts of easy ways to keep your food warm. Back in the days of Chazal, it wasn't so simple. You had a fire and that was it. So one of the things that people would do is they would insulate the food. You would heat it up before Shabbat and wrap it up in towels, and sometimes we still do this. And Chachamim gave a number of parameters in terms of how and when that can be done. But what Tosfot says over here is that if you have these cooked as part of already you have a pot of cooked food, and you have fruit, apples, or whatever it is that you want to insulate together with it. So he says, Asur lachzir karim uksatot ala kdera she'emahen. You can't put these cushions and covers, these things you're using to insulate, back onto the pot, or to add extra layers. In other words, if the food inside the pot was not fully cooked and I'm now covering it up, or I'm adding extra layers of heat, that is going to increase, that's going to expedite the cooking process, and that cannot be done. And that's what we find in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Nun Daled, source number 30 says, Peirot she'nechalin chayin. You have fruit which could be eaten raw. Mutar litnam sviv hakdera, af al pi she'ei efshar she'tzlu kodem chashecha. So you put the food around the pot. I guess you wanted to get, you want to heat it up, you want to cook it a little, but again, it's not considered cooking because you could eat it raw the way it is. You know, nowadays, sometimes you have chalot or whatever, sometimes people put on top of the urn, then you have a question, how can you kasher the urn for Pesach, right? That's something else. But, so he says, now in bold, mi tzarich lezaher, shelo yachzir hakisoi im nitkara mishchashecha, shelo leosif alav ad sheyitzolu. Again, not to cover up the food, not to cover up the pot unless it was fully cooked. Okay, the Biur Halacha says, again, remember when we discussed, when we get into the next sugya of Shehiyah, in terms of the Dinim D'Rabbanan, it's going to be very, very relevant, the different stages of the cooking process. There's a stage we call Machal Ben Drusai, which we'll discuss in more detail. That is what's called either half-cooked or third-cooked, meaning it can be eaten, but it's not cooked. If you asked anybody, they would say it's not cooked. You can eat it. Sometimes you eat food that's a little bit under that, but that is not yet cooked. Then there's a stage what's called fully cooked. Essentially, what we're saying here, we saw there was a machloket rishonim. If I have a food that has reached the stage of machal bin drosai, and I now go and cook it on Shabbat, is that considered cooking? Because on the one hand, you could say, well, it's not yet cooked, and therefore I'm cooking it. On the other hand, you could say, well, it's already edible, and therefore it's only when I take raw food that I'm liable for cooking. That is a machloket rishonim, but here we seem to paskin like the opinion that is more stringent, that says even if it's a machal bin drosai, we cannot cook it. So over the page,
is the definition of cook a relative? So what's cooking for me may not be cooking for you.
You're asking if it's subjective or objective.
Sure.
Generally, I think we would say that it's more of an objective definition. Right? That's exactly the truth is. Ben Drosai. Why is it called Machal Ben Drosai? Because there was an individual named Ben Drosai. Right? Everybody wonders what did Ben Drosai do? He was not really he was a bandit. Like the Gemara tells us, he was a robber. He would go and he had to cook his food very, very quickly because he was on the run all the time. So therefore, he would For him, it's cooked, right? For us, but it's not cooked. What did the Vendrosai do that he was zocher, that every time we learn Orchot Shabbat, we remember his name? Okay. But that's in any event. So the Orchot Shabbat over here, source 32, he gives a number of examples of expediting the cooking. If you, for example, we said adding layers on top of the pot, covering food. If you have a pot, if you were to take, sometimes you have a pot of cholent or whatever it is, if it's not yet fully cooked and you take the lid off, then you would have a problem in terms of putting the lid back on if it's still on the fire. Moving food to a hotter area. If I have a hot plate or if I have a blech and one area is not as hot as another, if the food is not fully cooked, to move the pot across to a place where it is hotter, that's going to be prohibited. And that is one of the reasons, we've mentioned this in the past, but it's always a good idea. We'll get to Shahiyah. We'll get to the definition of when I'm allowed to leave food on the fire before Shabbat. And even according to the opinions that say that even food that is not fully cooked, I could leave on the fire before Shabbat. Nonetheless, it's a good idea to always have your food fully cooked before Shabbat. You have soup, boil it up before, well in time, because then you avoid all sorts of issues like these. If I have a pot of chicken soup, which is cold when Shabbat comes in, right, and I put it on the hot plate, I haven't transgressed any prohibition. That's completely permitted to leave that pot of chicken soup on the hot plate cold before Shabbat. But if the lid's going to come off and I'm going to want to put the lid back on the fire, that's going to be prohibited. If I want to move it to a hotter area on the hot plate, I want to cover it up with the plata cover or whatever, all that's going to be prohibited because it was not fully cooked when Shabbat came in. So that's why it's a good idea always to boil it up beforehand.
By the time you want to put the lid on.
So again, the question is what was the stage when Shabbat came in?
If it was cold, you put it on the hot plate.
Yeah.
And whatever it is, it's there for a couple of hours, whatever. And by the time and you've taken the lid off to take food out, it's now boiling hot.
Right.
Then you put the lid back on again.
So if at the time that you take it is done, seemingly that should be okay. But the question is, do we look at the stage where it was when Shabbat came in, or do we look at the stage where it is now? So that is why it's a better. That's what he says over here. For example, if you see source number 32, just in brackets at the end of that, he says "Lachem yesh lizaher sheminiach me'av Shabbat kisoy agabe k'derat hamarak v'kisoy ze mechaseh gam et k'derat hachamim." He gives a slightly different example. Let's say you have your pot of soup and your pot of cholent together on the hot plate, and you have the plata cover that's covering both of them. So azai kasher notelet k'derat hamarak me'agabe ha'esh. If you now take the soup off the fire, you're going to leave your cholent for the next day. You're taking the soup off now. So what do? You remove the cover so that you can take the soup. So he says, if you're taking this whole cover off, you can't put it now back on top of the cholent if that's not fully cooked. That would be the violation of the cooking. Okay. What? Oh, we haven't got into that yet, but we'll discuss that soon. That's going to be the next topic in terms of exactly what we call shehiyah, which is what food am I allowed to leave on the fire before Shabbat? Right, that's going to be a din d'Rabbanan again. And I know I've been harping on about this for the last 2 months, but I'll say it again. There is no isur bishul. Right, the act of cooking is only when cooking d'oraita, when I actively do something on Shabbat in order to, I take the pot and now I put it on the fire on Shabbat. That could be cooking. If I just simply left the pot there before Shabbat, I'm not cooking on a Torah level. What am I doing? That's what's called sheyah. That's going to be a din d'Rabbanan. We'll get to that. We'll get exactly to those parameters. But before we get there, let's talk about one more subject, page 95, which is about melting ice and heating congealed liquids. Okay, so very interesting. Again, this is a subject that comes up very, very often as well. You have your chicken or whatever it is you want to put on the hot plate. Sometimes it's in a little bit of sauce, right? We discussed the fact about liquids versus solids in terms of bishul achar bishul. What if the sauce is congealed, right? And I'm going to put it, so it's now solid, but I'm going to put it on the hot plate and it's going to become liquid. Right? Or anybody who's ever heated up a piece of chicken knows that even if there's no sauce, there's always going to be a little bit of fats or whatever, and you put it on and it's completely solid, and by the time you take it off, Where did the liquid come from? Okay, so that's our discussion right now. So we have a Gemara in Shabbat that talks about crushing ice, snow, hail on Shabbat. Source number 33. This actually was relevant a couple of weeks ago. We had that big storm on Shabbat afternoon, and where I was, a lot of the kids, all of a sudden, were running around with cups with hail inside, and they were very, very excited. Are you allowed to do that? And what do you do with So the Gemara says here, it says ein merazkin. Okay, in modern Hebrew, we're more used to the term meraskin, right? But merazkin, the same word. Ein merazkin lot hasheleg v'lot barad b'Shabbat b'shvil sheyozovu mema. Right? If a person wanted to, you might think that you could take some snow or some hail, or some ice is really solid, so a bit hard, but same thing would apply. And you're going to crush it in order to get the water. Can you do that? The Gemara says you cannot do that on Shabbat. Doesn't say why. We'll see now why. The three-way machloket in the Rishonim, exactly what is the reason for this prohibition. And that's going to be, depending on which reason we accept, we'll see whether it's relevant to the case in our kitchen or not, in our chicken, congealed chicken juice. So you cannot take snow or hail or ice and crush it up in order to get the water. But if you place it into a cup, and then it's going to melt by itself, and then you have the water, then you can use the water. That is okay. Okay? So first question is, what is the reason for the prohibition here? Why do we say no? Second question is, when we say notenu latocha kos, latocha kehara, what are we talking about? Does it mean you place it into an empty cup? Right, and let it melt by itself, or does it mean you place it into a cup that already has water or juice or something else in, and then it will melt? Those are two different scenarios. So let's see. Rashi says, "Kadesh yazovu meimav," says mishum dekam molid b'Shabbat v'dami lemelacha sheboreh hamayim ha'elu. Okay, Rashi says the reason is, and this is something which comes up a number of places, the concept of molid. What does molid mean? Molid means we are producing something new. We are producing from the ice or from the snow, we are producing water. We find in the Gemara as well, there's a concept of molid reach. It's a smell from something. Sorry, was that a question?
I just wanted to tell you, my gardener is here. If there is anything that falls down, just tell her to come upstairs and tell him.
Sorry, I'll just... All right. I don't think that was a question directed at us. Okay. So, so we're talking about molid, where here you're creating water. We find different sugyas in the Gemara talks about molid reach, a case of creating a smell from something. It's very interesting. Then when we talk about the prohibition of electricity on Shabbat, many people don't know this, but one of the first tshuvot, the Beit Yitzchak, who discusses the invention of the telephone, and he talks about whether you can use, create this electrical current on Shabbat. He says that in the same way the Gemara tells us that there is a prohibition of molid reach, of creating this new scent, without getting into the details exactly what the discussion is over there. So he says he coins this term of molid zerem, where you're creating this charge, creating this current, it's electrical current. And according to many, many poskim, that is the reason you can't use electrical devices, can't turn on electrical devices on Shabbat, because of molid zera. What molid zera means that you cannot create a new charge, a new circuit, but if there is already a pre-existing circuit to adjust the frequency, that would be permitted. And that is why all the things of Machon Somet and the mobility scooters on Shabbat and all sorts of things operate based on that principle. It's fascinating. We're talking about melting ice on Shabbat. We get to electricity. So that's the way Torah works. It's all connected. I think in volume, I don't recall right now if it's in volume 20 or 21, but we have a whole section of shiurim dedicated to electricity on Shabbat. So we will get there as well. But going back to Asuga. So Rashi says mishum dekam molid b'Shabbat. Now we're going to distinguish. I'm sure you've all heard the term nolad, which the Gemara uses at the beginning of Masechet Beitza and other places, which is related to muktzeh. That is a separate concept. So there's the idea of molid, and there is the idea of nolad. Nolad means there is a new entity that is coming into the world that is related to muktzeh. Molid, something is a slightly different idea. This is the problem of producing something new, creating something. That is how Rashi understands the prohibition of crushing up the ice. He says, this is similar to a melacha in that you are creating this water, so to speak. Now, the second part, Shel yayin b'mot hachama kedei letzaneh. What does Rashi say? He says it's not an empty cup. You're placing it into a cup that's already there, a cup of wine, for argument's sake, right? And it dissolves by itself. We don't need to be concerned. Maybe the reason we don't need to be concerned is because it's not recognizable. There's not a new entity on its own. It's going to dissolve into the wine or into the water or into whatever else is in the cup. Okay, that is opinion number one, explanation number one of the Gemara. That is Rashi. We turn the page and we get to source number 35. And here we have the Sefer Truma. Sefer Truma, another one of the Rishonei Ashkenaz. He says, slightly different in the wording, but there is going to be a great difference, a great ramification from it. He says, Asur lim'och hasheleg v'la'asoto tzalul kumo mayim. Right? You cannot crush snow and make it like water. Mipnei shehu nolad. Okay, not molid, but mipnei shehu nolad. This is a separate explanation. He says, but now he says, based on that, again, the difference between molid and nolad may be that molid is more of an active form, something that I am doing. I'm crushing it up, and therefore I'm creating this water. But nolad means that something is produced. It's produced by itself. I wasn't actively involved in doing it, but it's related to muktzah. And therefore, he says, I'll give you another example where you would have the same prohibition of nolad, which is v'chein nireh she'asur latet pashtida. You take this pashtida, you take some fatty food, and you place it near the fire. The fat is the congealed fat is now going to dissolve and it's going to turn into liquid, right? That is going to be the same prohibition of nolad. So that is the Sefer Truma. Mentioned it's from Rishonei Ashkenaz. We're going to see the Ashkenazim are going to be concerned about this Chumrah, and the Sfaradim are not. Okay, but the same way we're going to see he's going to give a similar explanation to Rashi in terms of when would it be permitted. So in source number 36 is the continuation of the Truma. It says Aval imatzniach hatichat balad shekorin garza b'omek kalka kmo shosin beretz Ashkenaz. Okay, apparently they would take the pieces of hay and store them in the ground. That's what they used to do in Ashkenaz. And then you can take the piece of hail. This was the earliest form of making ice. And you can place it into the cup of wine in order to make it cool it down. That is allowed. Even though now it's going to dissolve. Right, you're not doing it, it's being done by itself. That's the point. That it is not recognizable. The whole issue of nolad is that there's a new entity that's being produced. This source is there, this fat is there that was not there before. It's now a liquid, before it was a solid. Yeah, before I had a cup of wine, and now I have a cup of wine. Okay, it's not so clearly recognizable, even though we know where it comes from. Okay, that's okay, but that's what's going to be allowed. And then the third interpretation we find in the Rashba. Okay, he understands a little bit differently. You write here as follows, source number 37. Masha katava Rav Zal, that's referring to Rashi. Mishum dekam molid, lav lemesa mishum nolad kamam. First, it's explaining to us the difference between molid and nolad, that it's two different ideas. And then he says the next paragraph, says this is incorrect. Okay, so the Rashba does not accept this idea that if you're going to dissolve it in a cup, that it's not, he says it's still creating something new. It's not going to be, it should not be permitted for that reason. And therefore he says that this whole prohibition of crushing ice is something else entirely. Have a look at source number 38. He says, Li nired mishum gzerat schitat perot hamdin lamashkin. Nagu ba mibnei shavarat v'asheleg lememehen hen omdim. Right? You remember from the first stuff of Beitza, where we have these gzerot of squeezing fruit and mashkim shazavu, etc. He says we have an isur of schita. Again, this is something we'll learn in later shiurim. I think schita is the most well-known melacha that is not a melacha. right? Everybody knows that you can't do schita. Schita itself is not one of the 39 melachot, squeezing. There's discussion. I think we mentioned it here previously. Discussion whether schita is a derivative of, whether it's related to the melacha of dash, which is threshing, or it's related to the melacha of melaben, which is laundering. And there will be nafkamina between the two in terms of what, in one of the upcoming volumes, there's an essay about using a magvonim, using wet wipes on Shabbat, and the Poskim discuss. Rav Shavai says, I think, about 4 different tshuvot on it. The reason he has so many tshuvot is because he wrote a tshuvah, and then people started arguing with him. They said, how can you say that? How can you say that? So he writes back, and in I think it might even be the first volume of Shut Min Chat Asher. So he's got, right at the beginning, he's got the 2 or 3 or 4 tshuvot relating to the use of magvonim on Shabbat. So very interesting, based on the question of schita. Schita means when you're squeezing out the liquid. So the question over there is when a person uses a wet wipe, those who prohibit will say, you need the liquid to come out. Those who permit will say, well, at the end of the day, it's not that you want, you using the liquid to assist you in terms of cleaning, but you don't, at the end of the day, you want the thing to be dry and to be clean. You don't want the liquid to all come out. Okay, that is an interesting discussion in of itself. But, so says the Rashba, this idea is related to squeezing schitat perot, squeezing fruits. And that is why you cannot squeeze your ice, crush your ice to get the water out, so to speak. Okay.
Here, we've been talking about putting ice into a liquid. How about the reverse? That you've got ice in a cup and you're pouring liquid on it?
I don't think there would be a difference. Meaning, if you, in terms of when the ice is, when it's going to dissolve, if it's in the cup of liquid, so then that's sufficient. The order is not important. Right. The difference would be if you just have, sometimes people pull out a bowl of ice and you're leaving it there for a long time, and then that's going to dissolve on its own. So that's something that the Poskim will discuss. But what we see 3 different explanations of this Gemara. And again, the case which the Sefer Truma brought in terms of the food. So possibly according to Rashi, maybe not, but certainly according to the Sefer Truma, if I have the congealed liquid now and I heat it up, that would be a prohibition. According to the Rashba, there would be no prohibition at all, right? And again, the only prohibition would be because of nolad, because something new is produced. So in the same way, and if I have the ice and it's in a cup of liquid, so if I have myself, let's say, for example, you have chicken that's in a little bit of gravy and it's heated up over rice, right? So then the liquid does not, I don't have the liquid by itself, it's absorbed into the food, and then that would not be a prohibition of nolad either. So let's see, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, source number 40. Shulchan Aruch says, Mutar litain infanda. Infanda is this, it's brought in the Rishonim, it's some sort of meat pastry, right, pashtida, infanda, whatever it is, but the point is that it has some very, very fatty food, and it's got that congealed fat inside. So he says, Mutar litain infanda keneged ha'esh, b'makom sha'yad soledet bo. It says you can place it near the fire where it's going to reach the temperature of yad soledet. Even though he says explicitly, even though the fat that is congealed is going to liquefy again. So that is the Shulchan Aruch. He says, like the Rashba, right? No problem at all. Says the Ramah, v'yesh machmirin, right? There are those who are stringent, v'nagul achmir. You'll all be shocked to hear. So interestingly, says the Ramah, we have here a chumrah. But in a makom tzorech, for example, you have nothing else to eat or whatever it is. But in a makom tzorech, there is what to rely on. So this is not meikar din, therefore it seems to be a tzei chumrah. The Mishnah Berurah says, the Mishnah Berurah, as we've seen in previous cases, we have this principle in Hilchot Shabbat, which is where I have a machloket haposkim, where I have a recognized opinion amongst the Rishonim, recognized opinion, even the Shulchan Aruch that says that it's mutar lekatchila, therefore certainly b'di'evet I could rely on that. So even if we are going to be stringent, not to heat up, this congealed gravy, if there are opinions, and there are opinions which would allow it lekatchila, therefore if somebody did it, I can eat it. I don't have to be concerned. Now the actual prohibition of crushing ice itself, that is also brought in the Shulchan Aruch a little bit later. You see source number 42. He says, "Hashelek v'abarag en raskinota." We cannot crush them on Shabbat. Dainu l'shavram l'chatichot takot kadei shazuvu memav, not to crush them into small pieces so that the water comes out. אבל נותן לתוך כושר יין או מים, ונמוך מאליו ואינו חושש. You place it in a cup and it's going to dissolve into the water, that is okay. וכן אם הניחם בחמה או כנגד המדורה ונפשו, מותרים. The Shulchan Aruch, right, his opinion is that even if you have a bowl of ice by itself, that's fine, because he's not concerned for nolad in this case. Now the Mishnah Berurah points out, he says, "Le'anot memvuad din demutar lekatchil la'aniach," right? As the Shulchan Aruch said, that you can leave it there by itself. Just skipping to the parts in bold now in source 43, it says, "Ladat Rama b'siman shin yud chet." Siftet zayin v'agasham. That's the Rama we've just seen. Gamacha yesh lachmir. Rama says that one should be stringent. After nimuach me'elav asur mishum nolad. Right, and again, this is the difference between molid and nolad. If it's molid, it's only when I'm actively doing it, right? And therefore the Shulchan Aruch is not concerned, but the Rama is a little bit more concerned here for a nolad. One more point, the Mishnah Berurah says in source number 44, he says that which we say that you cannot heat up this congealed, the fact that's where there's a lot of it. It's going to be recognizable. You'll have you'll be able to take a spoon and take out the gravy, whatever. אבל אם אין על הפשטידה כל כך שומן או שמעמידו כל כך ברחוק מקום מן החום שלא יהיה נמוך עד שיעזוב לחוץ אלא מעט ממנו, if there's only a small amount or you're only going to heat it up slightly, so there's only going to be a small amount of fat that's going to turn liquid, או אם ישליך לחוץ השומן שעליו מותר לך מפשטידה לכולי עלמא. Or if previously you've taken away all the fat, right, all the congealed, maybe before it's congealed, maybe after it's congealed, let's say before Shabbat, you cooked your chicken in sauce, right, and then you threw out all the sauce, or you put all the sauce into a different pot, whatever, and then you have the chicken, and then you heat that up. That's okay. There's going to be a little, like we said, a little bit of fat that drops off. That's not going to be an issue. That's what he says here at the end, after the boat. Af shadayin ifshal v'zav מבשר שומן שבתוכו, דבר מועט הוא ושארי לכולי עלמא. It's a small amount and that's permitted according to everyone. וכן, מותר לכם בשבת חתיכות בשר שמן, אף על פי שמקצתו זב, right? You have a fatty piece of meat, there's going to be a little bit of oil, that's okay, a little bit of fat. כאיבר דבר מועט הוא, הנפשר לא חשיב ושארי. That is not significant. Okay, for your arteries it may be significant, but for this is not. Okay, and then, so let's just turn over the page 100. Let's see the Orchot Shabbat summarizes here some of the dinim of ice on Shabbat. He says, "Ein l'aseh kerach v'sheleg l'ovcham l'mayim." Right, one cannot crush up ice or snow in order to turn it into water. מותר לתת קוביות קרח לתוך מים או משקה אחר ואין זה כלול באיסור קרח. As we've said, you can place ice cubes in your drink, and that is not part of this prohibition because it melts by itself. מם א', הפוסקים נחלקו אם האיסור לעשות קרח ולהופכו למים נאמר גם באופן שהקרח נמצא בתוך משקה. In other words, can you crush the ice while it's inside the liquid? Okay, that's a מחלוקת. I'm not sure why you would want to do that. מם ב', כלי שיש פה משקה קפוא ורוצה לזרז את הפשרתו, יש להחמיר שלא לתנור כנגד האש, אף שאינו יכול להגיע כלל לבישול. משום שאנחנו חושבים לדעת פוסקים, הסוברים שהנתינה במקום שמגיע אליו חום, האש, חושבת כריסוק בידיים. So he says here, if you have something, you have a cup with completely frozen liquid, so to put to change the whole thing from frozen to liquid, that you should avoid doing. He says, b'di'evet, it's okay. And the last in here, Mem Gimel, says, Natan kubiot kelach bekara leika. Right, as we said, if you have ice cubes that you place in an empty bowl, v'nimochu, and they now melt and turn into water, can you drink the water? As we said, but certainly b'di'evet, one could drink that water. There are those who said better to avoid it, or better to do that better not to do that in the first place. Okay, one more point about this congealed fat. Something interesting. We saw in source number 40 above. So if you turn back just for a moment to page 97, the Shulchan Aruch said, right, mutar litein infanda keneged ha'esh makom sha'yad solelet bo, ve'af al pi she'ashuman sheba shenikra shechozer v'nimoach. He said, right, we said the Rama is machmir on this because of nolad, but according to the Shulchan Aruch, you have this congealed fat in the food, you can place it on the fire or place it near the fire. We'll talk next time in terms of on the fire, near the fire, etc. So the Levush over here on page 101, the Levush in source number 47 says, Nir'eli sheta'utu, the kula gdola is. He says, I think, there is a ta'ut sofer, right? Where we find many times already, all the way back to the Gemara, right? When we had manuscripts and you're copying out manuscripts by hand, it happened that there were mistakes. And it's actually fascinating. Sometimes you see the Rishonim or the Achronim, learn a Sugya or learn a Gemara. Whenever we learn the Gemara, on every page of the Gemara, we have Hagot HaBach. Right, you have the little letters in the brackets, and the Bach changes the language of the thing, or sometimes Hagot HaGra, etc. Nowadays, we have access to things which the Rishonim and the Achronim did not have access to. You can go into the internet, you can go and you can access all the Gnizah, you can access all the different manuscripts that exist from the Gemara, and you can compare them one with the other. But what's amazing is when you have these Hagaot, or you have, the Rishonim or the Achronim who did it, they were not doing it based on archaeology, based on the fact that they found a manuscript somewhere, but they learned the Sugya, and they learn it inside out with all the commentaries, and they are the commentaries. And they say it's impossible, sometimes it's just impossible, it doesn't make sense. They say it must have been a ta'ut sofer. It must have been, there's a word missing here, a word missing that way. And especially when you consider that when everything was written by hand, and also parchment and paper was expensive. Often there are Roshei Tevot and there are abbreviations. One of the fascinating things, you go into the Gnizah project and you see the Kitvei Yad online. So you see sometimes in some versions you have Roshei Tevot, you have the abbreviations. Sometimes you don't have the abbreviations. And often the mistakes that are made or the discrepancies are based on, you have two letters, which can be one set of Roshei Tevot, or could be another set, and so that often happens. But here, the point is that sometimes you read it and they say the poskim or whoever it is say this doesn't make sense. It has to be different. So the Levush here says this Shulchan Aruch does not make sense. He says Nerali sheta'utu. This is a mistake. This is a ta'ut sofer. The kula gdola izo. This is too great a leniency. It can't be. V'lo matzati ken echad min haposkim. I haven't found any other poskim who say this. V'ra'oi liot makom she'ein hayad soledet bo. Right? What did the Shulchan Aruch say? Shulchan Aruch said you can place this food, you can place it near the fire, even in a place where Hayat Soledet Bo. He says, no. The Levush says he meant to say, or he did say, B'makom she'ein Hayat Soledet Bo. You place it in a place where it's not going to heat up. The congealed fat is not going to why? He says, even Makom she'Hayat Soledet Bo, Havelei mishum bishul v'asur. Says the Levush must be there's a mistake here. Why? Because others would be bishul. Until now we've been talking about molid, nolad, etc. Why would you say that it's bishul? Right? And the answer, why would you say? We said right at the beginning of the Shiurim, we said ein bishul achar bishul. The whole discussion we have here is something that is already fully cooked to start off with. So maybe what the Levush means to say is the following: right now it's solid, okay, but you're going to heat it up. And the congealed food is now going to melt, and now it's going to become liquid. We hold, okay, why he's so intent on this is a little bit strange, because we know that there are Rishonim who hold that even with liquid there is no bishul achar bishul. But nonetheless, the way we paskin, not like the Rambam, like the other Rishonim, that when it comes to a liquid food, we do hold sheyesh bishul achar bishul. That if my soup has cooled down, and again, when we get to it next week, we get to the dinim d'Rabbanan about when you can leave on the fire, when you can return to the fire. Right? That whole discussion, d'Rabbanan, only begins when I know there is no bishul d'oraita. When I know that it's considered fully cooked. So if I'm dealing with soup, I'm dealing with liquid, it has to be boiling hot, because otherwise it's not cooked. So he says, so now you start off with solid, but you end up with liquid. So how do I judge it? Do I judge it that I'm reheating a solid, and therefore there is no cooking? Or do I say that when I heat it and it becomes a liquid? You have the same question, by the way, when you prepare coffee, right? If you have coffee granules, which are solid, the minute that the water hits them, they become liquid. So there would be a different definition in terms of what's cooking or how can I cook. So the Levush seems to say that I'm placing it near the fire in a way that it's going to melt, it's going to become liquid. Well, now I have a problem of cooking, because I'm cooking the liquid. Okay, that's what he says, and therefore he does not allow it. Now the Magen Avraham, another one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, spoke before about how expensive it was to write things down. The Magen Avraham was lived in abject poverty, and he would at times he didn't even have paper or parchment or anywhere to write. He would write on the walls of his house the commentary that he had of the Shulchan Aruch. That's what I heard once. And many times in the Magen Avraham, you have lots of Roshei Tevot and lots of abbreviations because you don't have space to write. That's one of the things that makes it difficult to understand sometimes. That's why you have entire commentaries written, not super commentaries on the Magen Avraham, which is a commentary himself, Machzit HaSheker, Bri Megadim, and others. So the Magen Avraham says, he says, Linear de lo dami. He says, no, the Lavush is wrong. There's no mistake in the Shulchan Aruch. He says, what do you want? It's when you put it on, it's dry. It's a solid food. The fact that later on it turns into liquid, that's not my problem. When I'm heating it up, I'm not cooking. Okay? So the Mishnah Berurah says, Atam shemutar kevan shu yavesh, af shenitztanen lo shach beibishul od. As we say, with a dry food, when it cools down, there is no more cooking. Kmo shekatuv b'sif tetvav. Ve'af al pi she'shuman chozer v'nimuach. Even though it's now going to go and become liquid again, mikol makom mikra yavesh. This is still called dry. Kevan sheb'sh'ashna no lechamamo lo nimcha adayin. The time when I put it up, when I put it on the fire, it is still solid. Coffee, by the way, it's a bit more complicated because there it instantly turns instant coffee, right? It instantly turns from solid to liquid when I add the water. So there maybe that's a little bit different.
You put the granules. First the water and then the granules.
Yeah. As we discussed, that's been a cliché, etc. But yeah. That's So here, the Ochot Shabbat says like this, because based on what we've said, if you say that it's right now, it is solid. So let's ask the question. Let's say I have chicken soup. Let's say I've made my chicken soup in advance. I put the chicken soup in the freezer, right? Here's a patent. If you want to have chicken soup for lunch, on Shabbat in the winter. So it's my chicken soup's in the freezer. It's a solid block of ice. Put it on the okay. So we're Ashkenazim, so we're from Nolad. But based on this, you put it on the fire. It's solid. It's cooked. What's the problem? Ochot Shabbat says not so fast. Not so fast. Even according to the Magen Avraham, there is a difference. Source number 50. He says, in Eilich Ora, Tamosh Magen Avraham, Sheker b'shuman karus tzarich biyur. He says, we need to explain this. The sof hashuman atid yon nimuach, u'b'davar nozli yesh chashivut melacha lechimumo. At the end of the day, you start off with solid, it's turning into liquid. We said by liquid I have a problem of bishul. V'tzarich lomar. Dekevan shegam hashuman hakarush hu ochel, since this, in our case, this congealed fat, that is considered food, u'biyoto karush, even congealed fat. Essentially, what he's trying to say is that you could still eat it. Okay, it's better. You want it at the end of the day. You want it to be, the sauce, the liquid. It's tasty. That's the way it's meant to be eaten. But sometimes, you take food out of the fridge. It's a little bit. You could still eat it that way. It's still considered food. Therefore, I look at the time when I place it on the fire. That it's a dry food, which I'm placing on the fire. And therefore, even though it's going to melt, that is okay. I still relate to it as, I relate to it as congealed fat. I still relate to it as food. He says, and he quotes that in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. However, next paragraph now in bold, Me'ata nireh shemarak of, shevioto b'mkarel nasa kafui kamin jelly. Okay, we're going to talk in a moment about jelly and jello and the difference. But he says, you have a frozen soup, right? Or kafu kakerach, kshaya b'akpa, that you cannot place on the fire. Because there I relate to it as no one eats the soup when it's frozen, when it's solid, right? That's just it's still soup. I still relate to it even in its frozen state. I relate to it as a liquid that is frozen, and there's no other way to view it. The soup is liquid, and there's no other way to look at it, and therefore, if you want to have soup for lunch on Shabbat in the winter, you're going to have to find another way. I think a crock pot is probably the best way to do it. Okay, so that is in terms of when I have the solid food, or I have the frozen soup, or the congealed fat, or whatever. What about the other way around? What if I have something now and making ice on Shabbat, or making, it says here, this was done, the translators here are Americans, so it's making ice and jello on Shabbat. There's what they call in America jello, in other places in the world they call jelly. So in America, I think jelly refers to what we call jam. Right, so when I was growing up, it was always, in all the cartoons and all the movies, they always talk about a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Could never understand how could you put jelly in a sandwich. Okay, so the Shmirat Shabbat says, source number 51, he says, Tov lemanam natei b'Shabbat u'biyom tov mayim לתוך תא ההקפאה ומנת להופכם לקוביות קרח, אלא אם כן יש צורך גדול בכך. So is one allowed to freeze the water to turn it into ice on Shabbat and Yom Tov? Shmirat Shabbat says better, over here he says better to avoid it. If you look inside the Shmirat Shabbat, you'll see in the footnote over there's a long discussion. And he says that maybe it might actually be permitted, but here he seems to be stringent. Again, what would be the problem of making ice? Probably related to nolad. He says better to avoid it. He said if there's a great need, then there is room to be lenient. Rabbi Tzion ben Abishol, Rabbi Tzion Abishol says that it is permitted. Right? He says in the same way that the Shulchan Aruch says we can leave the ice to melt, so to do the reverse should be equally permitted. Rav Moshe Feinstein, there are actually conflicting views as to precisely what he said. Over here, in source number 53, he's quoted as permitting making ice, but if you look in the footnote, elsewhere he's quoted as saying that l'katchila one should refrain from it. So that is an open question in terms of precisely what Rav Moshe's opinion was. Right, and again, b'di'evad one would be able to benefit from it, since according to the Shulchan Aruch it is permitted. What about making jelly / jello on Shabbat? Right, you're taking the powder again and you're forming this. I think so. So the Shevet HaLevi over here in source number 54, he discusses. He says, "Asher sha'al binyan achanat jelly bazak b'Shabbat, instant jelly. V'ofen asiyato מערבין אבקה במים, you take powder and you mix it in water, ואבקה זו נמסה במים, והם נעשים כאין מי פטל, ולאחר כמה דקות נעשים כאין מרק סמיך." Okay, he's explaining to us how jelly is made. ואם שמים במקרר ומחכים עוד קצת, בצורה הסופית כאין ציל קלוש והוא הג'לי. It solidifies, and that is the final. So he says, לעניות דעתי, להחמיר לכתחילה להעמיד בשבת למקרר. He says, ideally you should be stringent for this. לדונו בנקרש כנולד לדעת ספר התרומה. Right, he says it's like the question we had of nolad, of Sefer Truma, right? This is the reverse of what the Sefer Truma said, but he says it's the same issue. So he says if there is a great need for it, and b'diavad it would be permitted, but l'katchila one should be stringent. He says there's another reason you have to be stringent as well, that this might be related to another melacha, which we will see in the later shiurim, which is the melacha of lash, of kneading. When you're taking this powder and you're turning it into this mixture, maybe that is related to the melacha of lash as well. Okay, so that is that concludes. Yeah.
Really need that.
Again, the only thing that I can think of, and you can probably relate to this, is a person who stays in a place where they don't have any food on Shabbat, right? A person's in, we can think of cases in the army, or we can think of, I don't know what it is. The only food, a person's in some foreign country and they don't have any food, they don't have any kosher food. The only thing they have is a packet of jelly. Never, right? For many reasons. But if that's all that they have, so that would be maybe a makom tzorech. Yeah. Right. So that's in terms of that. So just to summarize, we discussed the idea of melting ice and congealed liquids, and then we spoke about the reverse case. So we said that the Gemara tells us that we cannot crush ice or snow or hail, etc. on Shabbat, but we can leave it by itself. We saw three explanations for that Gemara. There was the explanation of Rashi that this is a prohibition of molid. It's an active, I'm engaged in something actively, but I'm creating something new. I'm creating that water, so to speak. There was a Sefer Truma, so it's a problem of nolad, which is similar to molid, but somewhat different, related to the prohibition of muktzah. Something new is being created, even though I'm not actively doing it, but I'm just facilitating that passively. And then the Rashba said, no, it's not molid, it's not nolad, it's got to do with schita. And based on that, we say, what was the din if I have congealed fat or gravy on the food in order to heat that up on Shabbat? According to the Shulchan Aruch, who follows the Rashba, there would be no prohibition. We saw a discussion about that. What about the issue of bishul? Right? We saw whether we view it as liquid or we view it as solid. But at the end of the day, we said we can be lenient in that regard. According to Ashkenazim, according to Ramah, we would have to be stringent because of the prohibition of nolad. Okay, we didn't mention it here in the sources, but we mentioned outside that even according to the Ramah does also say that b'makom tzorech, there is what to rely on, and therefore, if our concern is nolad, so I have a little bit of congealed fat that I'm worried about that's going to dissolve. I place it on top of rice or on top of some of the food, and then there would not be a problem in that sense. All of this is where there is a substantial amount of gravy that's going to come off. It's a small amount of fat that's from the chicken, etc. One thing I didn't mention is that it's always better to separate it before Shabbat, right? If on Shabbat, a person takes out a piece of chicken and you start scraping the fat off, well, then you get into a discussion relating to Melechet Borer, right? You're selecting. Again, if I take the chicken away from the fat in order to eat, that's fine. But if I take the fat away from the chicken, that's something I can't do. So that would be, and that would be prohibited on Shabbat. On Yom Tov, there would be no issue, but on Yom Tov, there would be no issue with any of this because you can cook, so that's fine. In terms of the ice itself, we said in terms of leaving a bowl of ice where it's going to dissolve by itself, for Ashkenazim, better to avoid that. But putting ice inside the drinks, that is permitted. And finally, what about the other way around? So we said in terms of turning water into ice or turning the powder into the jelly. So we said there as well. According to the Sfaradim, it's much easier. The Sfaradim say you can make ice, there's no problem. Ashkenazim, we saw conflicting opinions. Better to avoid, but Makom Tzorech also there is what to rely on. And the same thing in terms of jelly, not to make it as a question of lash, it's a question of nolad. But if you are in a Makom Tzorech, next time you find yourself in a situation on Shabbat where you really, really need the jelly, so then you can make it. But otherwise, you should avoid it. Okay, I think we will stop there for today. That concludes our discussion of Bishul D'Oraita. And next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll start talking about Bishul D'Rabanan. Very, very exciting, very complicated discussions. The first thing we're going to talk about is Shehiyah, which is in terms of leaving food before Shabbat. Just a word of caution, we'll need a little bit of patience in the upcoming Shiurim. It will take us some time to get through the principles, to get through the foundations, and after that, we'll get into the applications of different appliances, but we'll build it up step by step. Okay, Adkan.
Can one convert from Ashkenaz to Sephardi?